Okay, so let's unpack this. We're diving into a truly monumental figure today.
Oh, absolutely.
Someone whose work is, I mean, it's so vast, so deep.
Mm.
Trying to categorize it feels, I don't know, like trying to put the ocean in a bucket.
Or trying to categorize a whole new language.
Right.
It's that fundamental. Our focus is Ursula K. Guin, who lived from 1929 to 2018.
And her career spanned nearly 60 years. 60 years where well, she fundamentally redefined what science fiction and fantasy could even do.
Yeah, and it's fitting you bring up categorization because while she is, the undisputed master of speculative fiction, the architect of Earthsea, the sprawling, heinous universe, she always just preferred to be called an American novelist.
And that one detail, that insistence, it tells you everything you need to know about her intent. Right?
Exactly. She was using these fantastical tools, but not for escapism. It was for this really rigorous literary and philosophical look into how human societies actually work.
That's the core tension we're going to be exploring. A major voice in American letters, but one who, for the most part, chose to work outside that conventional literary mainstream.
And the output is it's mind-boggling. Over 20 novels, more than 100 short stories, poetry, criticism, translations, children's books.
Starting all the way back in 1959. I mean, the sheer scale of that is just staggering to think about.
And the recognition, it came fast and it was foundational. She hit major critical and commercial success almost right away with 2 books back-to-back.
Right. A Wizard of Earthsea in 1968.
And then The Left Hand of Darkness in 1969. A fantasy novel and a science fiction novel, 2 completely different registers, and they really set the tone for her entire career.
And it was The Left Hand of Darkness that, I mean, it didn't just get praise, it actually made history.
Absolutely historic. That novel, which digs into the ambisexual society on the planet Gethin, made Le Guin the first woman to win both the Hugo Award and the Nebula Award for Best Novel. Yeah, this wasn't just a win, it was a massive cultural benchmark. It was a signal that her kind of work that's focused on sociology, cultural contact, gender, it just couldn't be ignored anymore.
So this is where we get into the depth that you're looking for. To really appreciate the world she built, to go beyond just enjoying the story, you have to understand the blueprints.
Mm-hmm.
And we've identified 4, I say, distinct but really complementary pillars that shaped everything she wrote. These weren't just like casual interests. This was the intellectual DNA of her fiction.
And those are cultural anthropology, Taoism, feminism, and the writings of Carl Jung.
Exactly. And these are the scaffolding of her invented worlds. Her stories were always about balance, identity, power.
Cultural communication, all ideas that spring directly from those 4 traditions. If you can get a handle on these pillars, you really have a shortcut to understanding the depth that made her such a foundational modern author.
Let's start with cultural anthropology then. Because for her, this wasn't some academic topic she just picked up later. This was the air she breathed growing up.
Precisely. Ursula Kroeber was born in 1929 in Berkeley, California, into this intensely intellectual home. Her father was Alfred Louis Kroeber,
A huge name in the field.
a pioneer, one of the figures who really helped establish American anthropology as we know it today at UC Berkeley. So just imagine growing up in a house where the rigorous, non-judgmental study of human cultures and myths and language was just daily background noise.
It must have given her this radical early perspective on just how constructed our societies really are.
And the family influence goes even deeper than that. Her mother, Theodora Kroeber, was also an author. She found fame a bit later in life with her book Ishi in Two Worlds in 1961.
Right. Theodora also had a graduate degree in psychology, and this book was the biography of Ishi.
Exactly. Ishi was the last known member of the Yahi tribe, a tribe that had been systematically killed by white colonizers. He literally walked out of the wilderness in 1911 and became, in a way, a living anthropological subject for her father, for Alfred Kroeber.
What a profound story. It's about trauma, cultural contact, loss, survival.
And you can draw a straight line from that story to Le Guin's fiction.
Absolutely. The trauma and the tension in Ishi's story. The cultural outsider, the last of his kind, trying to communicate with this, an alien dominant world.
It's a foundational theme for her. You see it everywhere. The alien contact scenarios in the Hainish novels like Planet of Exile, the cultural destruction in The Word for World is forest.
Even the entire journey of Shevek in The Dispossessed, right? Moving between two totally isolated cultures.
Yes. Anthropology gave her the tools to build whole societies, but you have to think, the story of Ishi gave her the emotional weight, the understanding of what happens when those societies clash.
And we can't forget about the other people who were just, like, rotating through the Kruber household. The sources mention intellectual giants like Robert Oppenheimer.
The father of the atomic bomb, a regular family guest.
That's just a phenomenal detail. And it shows how she drew her greatest characters from life.
It really does. She later confirmed that Oppenheimer was the model for Shevek, the physicist protagonist in The Dispossessed.
And think about the complexity there for a minute. She takes this real-life figure, a man responsible for maybe the greatest hierarchical power structure in history, the scientific military complex,
and uses him as the template for a physicist trying to build a truly anarchist society based on sharing. Her personal life was just constantly feeding her fiction, providing these incredible, layered, real-world anchors for her most complex ideas.
And beyond the dinner table conversations, her early reading really solidified her interests. Norse mythology, Native American legends, her father told her.
She loved Lord Dunsany, and she even sent her first story to Astounding Science Fiction when she was only 11.
It was rejected, though.
It was, and that apparently caused a long break in her submitting her work anywhere.
And her academic path then gave her the literary muscle to back it all up. She didn't focus on science. She studied Renaissance French and Italian literature at Radcliffe.
Graduated Phi Beta Kappa, which, for anyone who doesn't know, is one of the most prestigious academic honors societies in the U.S., Then she got a master's in French from Columbia.
She was all set to get her doctorate in France on a Fulbright grant.
Right, but then, as she often told it, she met and married the historian Charles Le Guin in 1953, and that was, in her words, the end of the doctorate and the real beginning of her life as a novelist. They ended up settling for good in Portland, Oregon in 1959.
So she had this anthropological lens, she had the literary technique. Now let's pivot to the deep psychological and philosophical frameworks that gave her characters their internal struggles. Jungian psychology and Taoism.
What's so fascinating about Carl Jung is this idea of archetypes, these universal primitive images or ideas we inherit from our ancestors. And scholars consistently point to Jung's influence in her work.
Especially the idea of the shadow archetype.
Yes, the most famous example is in A Wizard of Earthsea. The young wizard, Ged, in a moment of pride and, wanting power, he accidentally summons this horrifying, shapeless evil.
The shadow.
That's it. That evil is seen as the perfect literary representation of the Jungian shadow archetype.
It's the ultimate internal battle. Your greatest enemy is the dark, repressed part of yourself that you just refuse to accept.
Right. But this is where the timeline gets a little sticky, right?
Yeah.
If Jung was such a clear influence, why did she claim she hadn't even read him yet?
Yeah, that's where the nuance comes in.
Le Guin was explicit. She said she had not read Jung before writing the first Earthsea books, which suggests she grasped these psychological truths intuitively.
Maybe she absorbed them through her mother's psychology degree or just the general intellectual air of the Kruber house.
It seems likely. But regardless, she later fully embraced the concept. She even lectured on her interpretation of the shadow and published it in her 1974 essay, The Child and the Shadow.
So it became a conscious tool for her, even if it started out as an intuitive one. The archetypal journey, that need to reconcile the dark and light inside yourself, is just fundamental to her work.
Absolutely. And you see other Jungian ideas, too. Concepts like the animus and the anima, the unconscious masculine side of a woman and the feminine side of a man. You see those explored all over her work on gender, especially in The Left Hand of Darkness and later Earthsea books like Tehanu.
So if Jung provided the inner scaffolding for her characters, Taoism provided the cosmic philosophy.
Exactly. She described herself as being raised irreligious as a jackrabbit. But she adopted Taoism so deeply that she eventually published her own translation of the Tao Te Ching in 1997.
And Taoism is just central. It's what gives her worlds their unique moral compass. It's an explicit rejection of that typical Western good versus evil dualism.
The core idea is equilibrium, the balance. In Earthsea, the entire archipelago, the relationship between land and sea, life and death, light and dark, it's all based on this delicate balance.
So if a wizard in Earthsea makes a mistake, they're not necessarily fighting some evil dark lord. They're disrupting a cosmic state of being.
Precisely. The evil in Earthsea isn't an external force trying to conquer the world. It's the character's own misunderstanding, or their overreach, or their lack of respect for that necessary balance. Evil is a disturbance of the whole system, not some separate, opposing entity.
That is a crucial distinction from most conventional fantasy, which is always about absolute good versus absolute evil. For her, Balance is the goal.
And reconciling opposites, like the anarchist collective of Anaras versus the hierarchical wealth of Uras and the dispossessed, that's the path to truth.
And that Taoist principle of non-meddling, Wu Wei, that must translate directly into how she writes about power and intervention.
It does, and this is where you see the anthropological pillar and the Taoist pillar just merge beautifully. Wu Wei literally means non-action or effortless action.
It's about leaving things alone, letting nature take its course.
Which is the ultimate goal of the Hainish anthropologists, the members of the Ikumen. They try to observe and study alien cultures without interfering, to avoid that colonial imposition of their own values. Characters in a book like The Lathe of Heaven also embody this.
And Guin in Earthsea learns that lesson early on, right? Magic should only be used when it's absolutely necessary.
Right, often for maintenance, not for dramatic change. This whole ethos of restraint is a direct import from Taoist thought, and it makes her narrative architecture fundamentally different from most Western stories of intervention and conquest.
So moving into the chronology of her writing, we can really see how these deep influences struggle to find a voice at first.
Yeah, that initial period, 1959 to 61, she was trying to write realistic fiction. It was set in a fictional European country she made up called Orsina.
She wrote 5 novels set there.
5, and publishers rejected all of them. They called them inaccessible. I think she had this complex anthropological approach to politics that just didn't fit into the commercial realism of the time.
So she had this huge intellectual framework, but no marketplace for it. That must have been incredibly frustrating.
It was a classic case of necessity driving innovation. She realized that science fiction and fantasy, with their established conventions for alien worlds and future societies, they gave her the vehicle she needed.
The distance she needed to explore these radical ideas without being constrained by contemporary realism.
Exactly. The genres gave her license to invent the rules of the society from the ground up and apply all that anthropological rigor.
And that pivot led her pretty quickly to the Hainish universe.
Yep. Her first professional SF publication was a short story, April in Paris, in 1962, and that led to the first 3 Hainish novels, Rocannon's World, Planet of Exile, and City of Illusions.
And it's worth remembering how humble the origins were. The first 2 were published as halves of an ace double.
Right, which for anyone listening was this low-cost paperback format where 2 novels were bound together back-to-back, 2 different covers. It really speaks to her, tentative first steps into the genre.
But those books were already doing so much more than standard genre fare. They were already incorporating those core Le Guin themes.
Absolutely. They formed the Hainish trilogy. They introduced her classic protagonist, the individual on an archetypal journey of self-discovery, usually across some vast alien landscape.
The themes were all there. Communication, cultural contact, reconciling opposites.
And she established the foundational tools of the Ikumen, that interstellar league of planets, including the Ansible. She actually coined that term in 1966 for an instantaneous communication device.
Then we get to that major turning point in the late 60s. She basically hit literary lightning twice in 2 years.
1968 and 1969 were just seismic. A Wizard of Earthsea in 68 was technically for a young adult audience, but it captivated everyone, and it was praised instantly for subverting fantasy tropes.
Most importantly, the protagonist, Ged, and most of the people in the archipelago, they were explicitly described as having dark skin.
Which was a radical rejection of the dominant white European default you found in almost all fantasy literature at the time.
And then The Left Hand of Darkness in 69, which took that same idea of subverting norms and applied it to gender.
That's the Hainish novel on the ambisexual planet Guin. It became a landmark in feminist science fiction, and boom, it immediately won both the Hugo and the Nebula. That whole period, from 66 to 74, is widely seen as her creative peak, with this rapidly increasing political focus.
What was it that catalyzed that sharpening of her political edge in the early 70s?
Well, Le Guin was profoundly affected by the Vietnam War and all the intense social upheaval of that era. Her anger over the war directly fueled The Word for World is Forest in 1973.
Which explored colonialism and militarism.
Right, by contrasting this destructive, hypermasculine, and frankly uncaring colonizing human society who are just there to harvest the planet's wood.
With the Earthsea natives, a gentle species who had adapted their whole way of life to the planet's ecology.
She used the story to make a very clear statement about imperialism. She even called it her most overt political statement in fiction.
It's a sharp critique of American imperial intervention and a powerful early text on ecological ethics.
And it won a Hugo Award. Deservedly so. The pace of her output and the acclaim during this period is just breathtaking. You've got the first 3 Earthsea books, this hugely political sci-fi, and it's all leading up to her anarchist masterpiece,
The Dispossessed in 1974.
which has the subtitle, An Ambiguous Utopia. It won both the Hugo and the Nebula again, making her the first person ever to win both awards for 2 different books.
And it engaged directly with political ideas from pacifist anarchists like Peter Kropotkin and the counterculture movements of the 60s and 70s.
And we can't forget the short fiction from this time. They're maybe the most distilled versions of her ethical philosophy.
The 2 powerhouses. The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas
Which won a Hugo?
and The Day Before the Revolution.
Which won a Nebula? Both are basically thought experiments disguised as fiction. Omelas especially is this enduring parable about the moral cost of happiness. These works just cemented her place as a writer of essential ethical inquiry.
So moving beyond that incredible era, the later decades of her career saw her really diversify. She showed she truly was an American novelist who refused to be boxed in by genre.
She started experimenting with all kinds of formats. There were realistic novels, like very far away from anywhere else in Malafrina, where she actually went back to her fictional Orsina setting.
But maybe the most radical structural experiment of her whole career came in 1985, Always Coming Home.
Yeah, that book is... It's hard to even describe as a novel. It just pushes the boundaries of what a narrative can be.
How did she approach it?
It's groundbreaking because the structure itself is an anthropological artifact. The whole book is a fictionalized anthropological report on a society called the Kish.
They're a pacifist, matriarchal society living in a post-flood Napa Valley.
Exactly. And Le Guin uses this non-linear kind of heterogeneous structure. She includes myths, rough drawings, musical scores, recipes, extensive field notes. It's a book that invites you, the reader, to be an active researcher and not just a passive audience.
It sounds like her father's influence came full circle, but she was applying it to a civilization that she invented herself.
That's a perfect way to put it. It uses her entire life's training. By presenting all this material as a collection of fragments, a carrier bag of information, you might say, she forces you to synthesize the culture for yourself. Critics praised its radical form. It was seen as one of the most important experimental works of the decade.
And she also returned to her most famous worlds later in life, especially Earthsea. But there was an 18-year gap before she wrote Tehanu in 1990. What prompted that?
That gap let her own philosophy evolve, especially her thinking on gender. Tehanu was a conscious revision of the earlier trilogy. It has a notably grimmer tone, and it directly challenges the gender dynamics of the first books.
Where men controlled magic and women were, well, limited.
Right. Tehanu focuses on the female protagonist, Tenor, and all the constraints placed upon her. It celebrates the power of quiet domestic life, the kind of stuff often dismissed in high fantasy. It won her a 3rd Nebula for Best Novel, which just proves her capacity for growth and self-critique.
And we see that same continuous evolution in her later Hainish work too, right?
Yeah, she went back to the Hainish cycle in the 90s with stories that pushed even further on sexuality and social rules like Coming of Age and Carhide. It's set on the same planet as The Left Hand of Darkness.
And she said herself that it was a story she couldn't have written in the 60s.
Right. She said it was so transgressively sexual and so morally courageous that she just wasn't ready for it back then. Her comfort level in exploring these complex, non-heteronormative relationships grew as she aged and as the culture around her shifted.
Her final fictional works were for adolescents, but they still had all that intellectual rigor.
Her final trilogy, The Annals of the Western Shore Gifts, Voices and Powers, was for young adults, but Powers, the last one, still won the Nebula for Best Novel in 2009.
So even in her later years, her focus was consistent.
Always. Stories about moral development, escaping societal constraints, and the responsibilities that come with personal power. Her final years were more focused on nonfiction, poetry, and translation, which gave us these really important collections of her essays and conversations that documented her thinking even further.
Okay, so now we get to the engine room, the core themes that really define her impact. And we have to start with the centrality of gender and sexuality, which is inseparable from The Left Hand of Darkness.
Yeah, The Left Hand of Darkness is still such a crucial document. The premise is just brilliant. On the planet Guin, the inhabitants are ambisexual. They exist in this state of sexual latency called Kemmer.
And only during their monthly fertility cycle do they adopt either male or female sexual characteristics, and it depends on the context.
Right. It's the most famous literary exploration of androgyny. It asks this radical question: what if gender wasn't a fixed, continuous social factor?
And the hypothesis was that this lack of fixed gender would eliminate certain types of societal conflict.
Yes. The Terran observer, Genly AI, he really struggles with Athenian society at first because his own fixed masculinity is a barrier. He perceives them as perpetually masculine just because of the language he uses. The novel suggests that the absence of fixed gender is what allows their society to operate without war, without that constant competition driven by sexual selection.
It's hailed as a landmark, but as we said, she was always evolving, and the novel got significant critique even as it was winning awards.
Oh, for sure. And from a feminist perspective, which is kind of ironic, right?
Exactly. What were the main points of contention?
Well, it was the pronouns. I mean, the Athenians are amosexual, but the text overwhelmingly uses masculine pronouns, he, him, to describe them.
Which inadvertently reinforces the masculine as the default human experience.
Exactly. And on top of that, while they had the potential to adopt feminine traits during Kemmer, the novel mostly focuses on political and institutional roles, which are traditionally masculine pursuits. Plus, it only really showed heterosexual pairings during Kemmer.
So even while challenging the structure of gender, she was still, in a way, using the structure of patriarchal language and narrative. How did she respond to that? Because her response is key.
She didn't get defensive. She engaged. She revisited these critiques in her essays and her later work. She actually apologized for the heteronormative focus. And crucially, she responded fictionally. In later Hainish stories, like Coming of Age and Carhide, she consciously used feminine pronouns for the latent Athenians, directly correcting that earlier linguistic bias.
And we saw that revision in Earthsea, too, right? In Tehanu, she tackled the ingrained patriarchy of that world head-on.
Absolutely. The original Earthsea novels had been criticized for presenting a world where power-high magic was almost exclusively for men. In Tehanu, she radically revised that. The book focuses on Tanar, showing that true fundamental power lies not in dramatic wizardry, but in the quiet, necessary work of nurturing and community power that's often dismissed as women's work. She just flipped the paradigm of what a heroic act is.
And this challenge to the heroic act brings us directly to her most important piece of nonfiction on this: the carrier bag theory of fiction. This is a concept we have to spend some time on. What is she critiquing?
She's critiquing the traditional narrative form of Western civilization, which she calls the killer story. This narrative, she argues, is all about the spear, the arrow, the sword. It's the story of the hero, usually male, who goes out, hunts, dominates, and conquers, and it all leads to this big climax of confrontation.
It's a story based on hierarchy, aggression, and singular achievement.
And she argues that the first tools humanity made weren't weapons at all. They were containers. The carrier bag, the basket, the sling, the pot. Tools made not for killing, but for gathering, holding, and sharing. The killer story, she says, is a distraction from the true, more essential, and probably older narrative of human survival, cooperation, and community.
So she proposed this carrier bag theory of fiction. What does that look like in practice in her books?
Well, it fundamentally shifts the focus of the story. Instead of a straight line toward a single violent climax, the carrier bag narrative is about process, complexity, relationships. It's heterogeneous. It holds many different things at once, just like Always Coming Home does, with its poems and recipes and myths.
It rejects the idea that a story has to be a weapon.
Exactly. Her protagonists, like Jed trying to integrate his shadow, or Shevek trying to build a better society, they aren't conquering villains. They're gathering knowledge, maintaining balance, and striving for reconciliation. It's a narrative of humility, not domination.
That shifts us perfectly to her third core theme: anarchism, utopia, and that unrelenting critique of power. If she doesn't believe in the killer story, she definitely doesn't believe in centralized authority.
Not at all. Alternative political systems are a constant experiment in her work. And The Dispossessed is the ultimate thought experiment. It's subtitled An Ambiguous Utopia for a Reason.
And it draws from pacifist anarchists like Peter Kropotkin, who championed mutual aid over state control.
Right. And Le Guin is widely credited with helping to, quote, rescue anarchism from the cultural ghetto and bring it into serious intellectual consideration.
So let's look at the contrast between the twin planets Uraz and Anars.
Uraz is a planet of incredible wealth, but it's also deeply authoritarian, capitalist, hierarchical, misogynistic. Anars, the moon where the Odonian anarchists live, is materially poorer. It's dusty, resource scarce. But the society is based on cooperation, decentralization, and individual liberty. No money, no mandatory government.
It sounds like a perfect utopia on paper, but she called it an ambiguous utopia. So where's the ambiguity? What's the flaw?
The ambiguity is in the tension between total individual freedom and the necessary structure of a society. The Odonians on Inaris, they're free from state oppression, but they often face this cultural rigidity, a psychological pressure to conform.
A kind of bureaucratic inertia even without a bureaucracy?
Exactly. Shvek, the protagonist, he feels this loneliness and these stifling cultural expectations that contradict the ideal of free association. He realizes freedom isn't static. It requires constant active effort.
And it's his journey, the physicist modeled on Oppenheimer, between these two imperfect systems that drives the whole story.
It is. He travels to Uros, the hierarchical society, to break the isolation of his own people, realizing that his own society has become subtly restrictive in its own way. Le Guin shows that power doesn't just live in governments, it lives in social consensus, in cultural expectations, in shame. True freedom, Shvek learns, has to be chosen every day.
And if The Dispossessed shows the complex internal failures of an anarchist state, the short story, The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas, shows the damning external cost of a conventional utopia.
Omelas is a true philosophical knife twist. It describes this society of universal joy and security, a perfect utopia. But then the text reveals that all this happiness is absolutely contingent on the perpetual misery of a single neglected child locked away in a basement.
And all the citizens know the child is there. They know if that child were helped, the whole paradise of Omelas would collapse.
And the parable ends with some citizens just walking away into the wilderness, never to return.
What makes that story so enduringly powerful?
It works as a critique of contemporary society. It's basically asking you, is your comfortable life dependent on some unseen systemic injustice, global poverty, environmental destruction, whatever it is? And the story doesn't tell you where the people who walk away go. The ethical weight is on you, the reader, to decide what the moral course of action is. It forces you to confront the hidden costs of your own prosperity.
So we've established the content and the concepts. Now let's look at the legacy. Le Guin spent a lifetime fighting for her work to be taken seriously, which often meant challenging the very genre labels she was stuck with.
This is such a crucial part of her career, because her fiction focused on sociology, psychology, philosophy, rather than, say, rocket science. She got labeled the patron saint of soft science fiction.
A term that was often used pejoratively to dismiss works that focused on the humanities.
And, intentionally or not, to marginalize the writing of women and other underrepresented groups in the genre.
So it wasn't just descriptive, it implied a lack of seriousness.
Exactly. And she found the label divisive. Instead of soft science fiction, she proposed a different category, social science fiction. This acknowledged the speculative part, but anchored the work in scientific inquiry, specifically the study of human behavior and culture, which was her unique strength.
She was always rejecting the idea that stories rooted in social structure were somehow less rigorous than stories rooted in astrophysics.
And that resistance created friction among critics. She and other scholars called it the balkanization of criticism. Her works were reviewed separately by children's lit critics for Earthsea, by SF critics for the Hainish novels, and the mainstream literary world often missed the connection.
She famously called the dismissal of children's literature, especially the deep moral work in Earthsea, adult chauvinist piggery.
She did, and yet, despite all the genre debates, her prose was consistently hailed by major literary critics.
Mainstream critics just couldn't ignore the quality of the writing.
Absolutely not. Harold Bloom called her an exquisite stylist, noting her lyrical style and her moral relevance. The New York Times praised her lean but lyrical style, a perfect blend of precision and poetry that let her explore these complex ethical issues without ever sounding preachy.
And her influence on the generations of writers that came after her is just undeniable.
Enormous. After she died, Michael Chabon called her the greatest American writer of her generation. Zadie Smith praised her prose. David Mitchell, Salman Rushdie, they all cited her influence. Neil Gaiman gave maybe the most profound compliment.
What did he say?
He said he learns more from her books at every stage of life than from any other writer, which just underscores the enduring complexity of her moral lessons.
And her legacy isn't just in the prose. It's in her high-profile activism, her willingness to use her voice and her awards to take these principled stands.
Her activism was incredibly principled. In 1977, she took the radical step of refusing a Nebula Award for her story, The Diary of the Rose. To protest the science fiction writers of America's decision to revoke the membership of the Polish author Stanisław Lem, she cited the group's political intolerance and said she wouldn't be associated with an organization that acted that way.
And she kept that confrontational stance against the new power structures of the digital age.
Yes, this is a major part of her later legacy. In 2009, she famously resigned from the Authors Guild over its endorsement of Google's book digitization project. She believed the guild had betrayed the core principles of copyright.
She wrote in her resignation letter that they had decided to deal with the devil.
She did, and then she took aim at the dominant force in books today, Amazon.
Her National Book Award acceptance speech in 2014, that was a powerful moment that got massive media attention.
She didn't just accept the medal. She used the platform to sharply criticize Amazon's control over publishing, arguing that the market had become defined by commodities, not works of art. Her activism just highlighted her consistent belief that art and literature are essential human functions that have to be protected from corporate domination.
It's incredible that a writer who so actively resisted the establishment still won so many awards from that same establishment.
It just speaks to the undeniable quality of her work. 8 Hugo Awards, 6 Nebulas, 4 for Best Novel, more than any other writer, and 25 Locus Awards. The U.S. Library of Congress named her a living legend. She won that National Book Foundation medal. Her lifetime recognition really solidified her position as a writer who transcended the very genre divides she fought against.
And we have to circle back to the Ansible. Her coinage of that term is such a great example of a fictional concept becoming part of the genre's shared vocabulary.
It is. She coined it in 1966 and wrote Cannon's World for an instantaneous interstellar communication device. The concept was so elegant and so necessary for far future storytelling that other major authors like Orson Scott Card and Neil Gaiman just adopted it. It's a quiet tribute to her world-building rigor.
Finally, we should touch on the difficult issue of adaptations, especially given her emphasis on race and identity in her work.
Le Guin was notoriously cautious and often critical of adaptations. She considered the 1979 film of The Lathe of Heaven the only good adaptation she'd ever seen.
She was disappointed by the Studio Ghibli adaptation of Earthsea.
She was. She felt the film prioritized spectacle and violence, missing the moral and Taoist focus on balance and reconciliation.
But the television adaptation was the most offensive to her core principles.
Oh, absolutely. She saved her strongest condemnation for the 2004 Sci-Fi Channel miniseries Legend of Earthsea. She publicly and unequivocally objected to the fundamental betrayal of her vision, specifically the whitewashing of her non-white characters.
She had painstakingly established that Earthsea's inhabitants were people of color.
And the decision to cast white actors in the lead roles was, for her, a deep and unacceptable insult to the original text's meaning and its radical nature.
And yet, her influence endures. A forever stamp from the U.S. Postal Service in 2021, and just this year, 2024, a crater on Mercury was named in her honor. A legacy both grounded in social reality and, literally, extended into the cosmos. So, after all this, what does it all mean for us today? If we synthesize this deep dive, we see an author who used the framework of fantastical worlds not just for entertainment, but to become one of the most rigorous and insightful social critics of her generation.
She truly did. Her pivotal role was integrating this profound literary complexity, this deep philosophical inquiry from Taoism and Jung, and these radical social critiques on gender, race, politics, all into speculative fiction. She created worlds that were functional blueprints for how to think differently.
Her consistent overarching theme, from the first Hainish novels to the last Earthsea books, was always that search for self, and the necessary reconciliation of opposites, light and dark, individual and society, anarchy and hierarchy. Her fiction functions as these essential ethical thought experiments, always trying to achieve that Taoist ideal of equilibrium.
Right. She wasn't just inventing worlds. She was, as she put it, being a realist of a larger reality. Le Guin once said that hard times are coming, times when we will be wanting the voices of writers who can see alternatives to how we live now. This entire body of material suggests her work offers not just fictional escapes, but fully realized complex models for rethinking freedom, community, and power.
Which leaves us with a final provocative thought for you to mull over.
Considering the costs and benefits of her invented societies, the materially poor but ethically advanced anarchists and ours, the pacifist matriarchal Kesh of always coming home, or the painful communal trade-off of Omelas, which of these radically different social contracts provides the most realistic vision for change we can and should explore in our world today?
A challenge well worth taking.